the overlooked metric that rewrote risk. It lived in plain sight, buried inside reports everyone skimmed and no one questioned. A metric treated as background noise, too boring to matter, too stable to deserve attention. Yet this single number would quietly dismantle the way risk was understood across the market. To understand why this mattered, we need to go back to a time when risk felt measurable, contained, and under control. Models were trusted. Thresholds were clear. If certain numbers stayed within range, portfolios were considered safe. And the overlooked metric always stayed within range, until it didn't. This story matters now because markets still rely on indicators that feel familiar rather than meaningful. Risk isn't hidden because it's complex. It's hidden because it hides inside assumptions no one thinks to revisit. The first reveal begins with a risk analyst assigned to review routine exposure reports. He wasn't searching for weaknesses. He was confirming compliance. Limits were respected. Stress tests passed. Everything looked orderly. But one column caught his attention, not because it moved, but because it never did. The metric tracked liquidity usage under normal conditions, not during crises, not during extremes, just everyday market functioning. And for years, it showed stability so consistent it raised suspicion. Real systems fluctuate. This one barely breathed. The second reveal came when he compared the metric across desks and strategies. Different assets, different time horizons, different mandates. Yet the number behaved almost identically everywhere. It suggested a universality that shouldn't exist. Risk wasn't diversified, it was synchronized. The third reveal emerged when he adjusted the calculations slightly, stripping out assumptions baked into the reporting logic. The result changed instantly. What had looked stable fractured into sharp variation. Some strategies relied heavily on constant liquidity. Others barely needed it. The metric hadn't been measuring resilience. It had been averaging it away. And in that moment, the analyst realized the market wasn't managing risk. It was smoothing it, hiding fragility beneath a number everyone trusted and no one truly understood. Once the analyst saw the fracture, he couldn't unsee it. He rebuilt the metric from the ground up, removing the assumptions that treated liquidity as always available. The new view was unsettling. Under calm conditions, everything still looked fine, but under even moderate stress, usage spiked violently in specific strategies while others remained stable. Risk wasn't shared, it was concentrated. The conflict began when he presented this to his team. The reaction was defensive, not dismissive. Everyone understood the implications immediately. If the revised metric was correct, then years of risk management had been built on a comforting average rather than a truthful distribution. Stability had been assumed because variability had been hidden. Senior managers asked for comparisons. He delivered them. Historical stress events suddenly aligned with the revised metric. Losses once attributed to bad luck now mapped cleanly to strategies dependent on constant liquidity. Near misses made sense. Hedging failures became explainable. The metric wasn't just informative. It was diagnostic. The tension deepened when the analyst suggested a simple change. Report the metric by dependency, not by average. Show where liquidity mattered most. Show where the system would strain first. The room went quiet. This wasn't a technical tweak. It was a structural challenge. Adopting the change would force portfolios to rebalance. Some strategies would look riskier overnight. Others would lose their perceived diversification benefits. Capital would need to move. Performance would shift. Careers would be affected. The number hadn't just rewritten risk. It had threatened comfort. Resistance followed. Not overtly. Requests for further validation. Questions about methodology. Suggestions to pilot. The change quietly. The analyst recognized a pattern. The system was buying time. But time wasn't on their side. As markets evolved, liquidity dependence increased. Strategies grew faster, more automated, more synchronized. The old metric continued reporting calm, while the revised one flashed growing stress. Two realities existed side by side, and only one of them was visible to decision makers. The analyst escalated the issue carefully, framing it as preparation rather than criticism. He showed how the revised metric didn't predict crashes. It predicted vulnerability. where small disruptions could cascade, where exits would narrow first, where diversification would fail quietly. That framing landed. Leadership didn't argue. They asked for implementation scenarios. What would it look like if the revised metric-guided risk limits? What would change? The answers were uncomfortable, but clear. The firm would become less aggressive in calm markets and more resilient in stress. The question wasn't whether the metric was right. It was whether the firm was willing to let it rewrite the story it told itself about safety. And that decision was about to be tested. The test arrived sooner than expected. A modest market disruption. Nothing historic, nothing dramatic. Rippled through liquidity channels unevenly. Prices moved, but not violently. Headlines stayed calm. On the surface, it looked like another routine adjustment. Inside the firm, the two versions of the metric told radically different stories. The old metric barely reacted. It showed stability, comfort, continuity. According to it, risk was contained. The revised metric, however, spiked instantly. It revealed stress clustering in the exact strategies the analyst had warned about, those dependent on constant execution and uninterrupted liquidity. The difference was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. The conflict intensified when those strategies began underperforming, not collapsing, straining. Execution costs rose. Slippage widened. Hedging behaved erratically. Small inefficiencies compounded. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to force uncomfortable conversations. Why were the safest strategies suddenly the most sensitive? Risk teams watched the dashboard diverge. One view said everything was fine. The other showed pressure building. And for the first time, leadership had to choose which reality to trust. The buildup accelerated as volatility lingered longer than expected. Markets didn't rebound cleanly. Liquidity returned unevenly. Some desks stabilized quickly. Others struggled. The revised metric mapped the divergence almost perfectly. The old one remained calm, blind to the strain. That precision changed everything. Executives realized the overlooked metric hadn't just rewritten risk. It had exposed timing. It showed where damage would emerge first, not where it would be loudest. It identified fragility before it became visible, and that made it dangerous to ignore. The tension peaked during an emergency risk meeting. Capital allocation was on the table. If they followed the revised metric, exposure would need to shift immediately. Performance would change. Some high-profile strategies would shrink. Others would gain influence overnight. But if they ignored it, they would be betting that calm would return before stress escalated. The room divided. Some argued the disruption was temporary. Markets always stabilize. Others pointed to the data. This wasn't about direction. It was about dependency. Strategies that require perfection were already under pressure. Waiting would only concentrate the problem. As the debate unfolded, one truth became undeniable. The metric wasn't predicting disaster. It was revealing how close the system was to needing one. And in that moment, leadership understood that the next decision wouldn't just shape returns. It would decide whether risk was managed proactively or explained after the fact. The choice was no longer abstract. It was immediate. And whatever they chose next would rewrite how the firm survived the next phase of the market. The decision came quietly, without a dramatic vote or announcement. Leadership chose to trust the revised metric. Not fully, not publicly, but enough to act. Capital was reallocated. Exposure was reduced where liquidity, dependence ran highest. Risk limits were adjusted to reflect vulnerability instead of comfort. It wasn't framed as a correction. It was framed as prudence. The climax arrived days later when markets faced another bout of stress, stronger than the last, but still not a crisis. This time, the outcome diverged sharply. Strategies flagged by the revised metric absorbed the shock with minimal damage. Those outside the adjustment struggled. Across the broader market, losses spread unevenly. Inside the firm, the contrast was unmistakable. The overlooked metric had done what no headline ever could. It had prevented damage before it demanded explanation. As volatility faded, the implications settled in. Risk wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It accumulated quietly in places where assumptions went unchallenged. The old metric hadn't been wrong. It had been incomplete. It smoothed away the very information that mattered most when conditions changed. The resolution unfolded over weeks. Reporting standards shifted. Risk reviews changed tone. Instead of asking whether limits were breached, teams began asking where dependency lived, where liquidity mattered most, where patience disappeared first. The firm stopped treating averages as safety and started treating distributions as truth. Other institutions noticed, not through press releases, but through behavior. Performance stabilized. Drawdowns softened. Execution improved under stress. The industry didn't adopt the metric overnight, but curiosity spread. Quietly, reluctantly, inevitably, the analyst returned to his routine work, his role unchanged, his name uncelebrated. But the number he had questioned now sat at the center of every serious discussion about risk, not because it was complex, but because it told the truth without smoothing it. The lesson was simple and unsettling. Risk doesn't hide in extremes. It hides in assumptions we stop questioning. And sometimes the most important metric isn't the one that moves the most, it's the one that never moved at all. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The